Instead of just buying an enrichment tool and enriching your CRM, you're building AI workflows or AI agents. You're looking at unstructured data. You're looking at data on the web. You're doing things that just literally weren't possible 18 months ago.
Hey, everybody. I'm Hayes Davis. I run the Uncharted Territory newsletter. And if you're a reader, you know, occasionally we like to throw little multimedia conversations into these. Not quite a podcast, but maybe close. I've been looking into a fairly new role that's existing in go-to-market organizations, the GTM Engineer role. If you're on LinkedIn, if you're anywhere around go-to-market, you can't avoid it. I was at the Pavilion CRO Summit last week, and it was a big part of the conversation there. So today I've got Brendan Short, and he writes the Signal newsletter on Substack. So I'll make sure to include a link to that. But he's been thinking a lot about the GTM Engineer. And one of the things that brought him to my attention is he wrote an article, I guess, back in November, I think, about the rise of the GTM Engineer. And then he's published several things since then that I think are really relevant. Excited for this conversation today. We're going to talk about GTM engineers, what CROs need to know about them and that role. So Brendan, welcome. Maybe do a quick intro for us.
Sweet. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Hayes. Appreciate it. Excited to chat with you. Yeah. I started my career as an SDR. Before that was a title 12 years ago. And then I joined a company and kind of went 0 to 10 million and was an SDR, then an AE, and then a sales leader. And then I kind of stumbled into doing some ops stuff because we didn't have somebody doing ops, and then eventually hired somebody doing ops. I've been at a couple of big companies, Zoom Video and then Apollo. And I've also started a couple of companies, both in the sales tech space, and raised venture capital for those to varying degrees of success. And now I'm writing The Signal, and basically just exploring the future go-to-market playbook and doing some consulting around that topic as well. And yeah, I mean, I would say up front, like I am trying to figure out where we're at in this moment in time, where things are going, what is actually working today. And I think a lot of things are shifting right now. And so I'm trying to kind of figure that out and just doing that exploration in public and helping kind of share how I'm thinking about it, the resources I'm coming across, tools that I'm coming across, new roles that are emerging. And yeah, just kind of think about the Signal as like a way to explore that as like a public diary.
And that's awesome. And I really appreciate the newsletter and the voice and everything that you're bringing to that. I've been reading for several months. And I think we were just talking before we actually started recording here that everything is changing in go-to-market. And, it's been said so many times that it just sounds like a cliche. And of course, we thought 2 years ago, 3 years ago, everything was changing, right? But like, it's just really hard to, I think, convey the just fundamental kind of seismic shift that's going on. And I'm curious, I just said it's really hard to convey it, but like if you were trying to convey it to a CRO, like if you want like one thing for like CROs to really be thinking about the change that's going on in this moment, what would you say?
Yeah. So number one, I think the old playbook is broken. Everybody knows that and agrees with that. This kind of like predictable revenue playbook. I think number two is growth at all costs is behind us. We got to be actually efficient with dollars and think about like revenue per sales rep. I think that the world is noisier than ever before in terms of like getting in front of potential buyers, getting attention. There's way more competitors than ever before because the cost to build software is, and the ease of building software is lower than ever before. And then I think we have the fourth thing is like we have this magical tool called AI, which is incredible, like leverage, and it's an advantage if you know how to use it. I've been spending a lot of time exploring how AI can and should be deployed in go-to-market. I think there's a handful of ways where it makes sense and it's nuanced. I think there's a lot of ways that people are trying to use AI and it doesn't make sense. And so we could talk about those things, but I think that's the main thing is like there's this amazing thing called AI that we're very early. I think I have strong conviction that we're very early, and the companies that are adopting AI are going to, I think we're going to look back in a year or two and say, okay, those are obviously the companies that figured out how to build their go-to-market org in kind of an AI native way. And so that's like top down and bottom up. And so if I was a CRO today, like that's all I would be spending my time. Like the vast majority of my time, it would be thinking about how do I get the most leverage out of this new opportunity on top of all the fundamental stuff that you don't throw everything away. This is just like a new thing on top of it. So that's my current take that is, yeah, I have a strong conviction on, but maybe it changes over time.
Well, and I think the reason I'm kind of starting with this conversation as we get into the role of the GTM engineer is I think that, this role is partly, in my mind at least, a creation of this moment in time. It's this like opening of a set of capabilities that exist that didn't exist in the past, or existed in such a rudimentary way it didn't really make sense to collect it into a role. Before I dive into that, though, I wanna ask. You mentioned two things in that little discussion there. Number one, the old playbook is broken.
Right.
So that's a truism, right? We hear that all the time. Go a little deeper there. What do you feel like is fundamentally broken there? What used to work that just doesn't work now? And I'm just curious if your research and the things that you're doing kind of show you like maybe something unique there.
Yeah, the when I say the old playbook is not working, I mean like hiring a bunch of SDRs and AEs, throwing a B2B database and a sequencing tool at them, and just saying like, hey, just play the volume game and hit your number. It's not that it doesn't work. That's like, too binary, but it doesn't work like it used to. It doesn't work like it used to. And I have yet to say that or be in a conversation where that is said and hear like somebody disagree with that. I think everybody feels that. So it's almost like silly to say it, but specifically, I think that's how I would frame it. And again, it's not to say that like SDRs and AEs should not exist or that sequencing tools should not exist. I think it's more the fact that there is a new and a better way to do things to make the existing reps more efficient, to be able to double your revenue number next year without hiring many or any more sellers. Like I'm seeing this firsthand. This is possible. It's hard, by the way. It's very hard. It's not an easy button. I think, I don't want to bash like sequencers, but if I look back at sequencing tools, in many ways, I think that they were an easy button and you could just, whether you're sending one email or 100 emails a day as a rep, it was just as easy. And that's not the case with deploying AI. It's very difficult. It's very messy. You got to hack a bunch of stuff together. The tooling is very immature. It's changing incredibly fast. And so you have to stay up to date on this stuff. So I think that there is incredible leverage in building a go-to-market org in this new way, but it's really hard to do, is the truth.
That seems to very much be the case. And part of it is I think we're all learning what the playbook should be going forward. I think to your point about the old playbook, the old playbook was, I always kind of liken it to, an old school kind of military analogy, right? It was just like create more mass and you can get this kind of linear output, right? I put a rep in, I get kind of a linear output from that rep. I think AI creates this different situation where there's the potential, even though it's very hard, for exponential output because the input is not just this pure linear thing. So I think we've got kind of two phenomenon happening. Just my take on it is like the old school kind of linear approach, add a rep that added a certain amount of revenue, that's started to break down. It's now kind of like sublinear, right? So it just makes it more and more expensive on a per head and on a CAC basis as you add reps. But then AI creates the opportunity potentially to turn it back to not just linear but super linear, where it's actually like growing much faster than headcount. And that's the promise of this kind of moment, I think. And so that leads us back to like, we're now dealing with these teams that need to be this like confluence of both people and systems and AI, like all kind of put together in a way that I think is kind of unique. And that's where the GTM engineer role, I think, really kind of starts to come into play. So maybe from your perspective, what's the key problems that you see a GTM engineer, like, why did that role emerge? Why did it emerge now? And what's it for?
Yeah, so it is for leverage. It is for creating efficiencies in your go-to-market org. I think the first place that people look is like, oh, I'm going to buy Clay and I'm going to do a bunch of AI outbound. I think that's like Not all bad, but I think that's like the first, the first place you would look. And I'm seeing that the more thoughtful and creative approach to leveraging a GTM engineer is thinking where in my go-to-market, in the life cycle of a buyer's journey, where can I create more leverage, right? And so I think that's like if you're doing cold outbound or warm outbound or signal-based selling, fine. That's cool. You should do that instead of cold outbound. That's better. But I think there's just like a lot of other interesting places where a GTM engineer could be leveraged. And I think that could be in like data and systems, which is more like a traditional RevOpsy type thing. But instead of just buying an enrichment tool and enriching your CRM, you're like building AI workflows or AI agents. You're looking at unstructured data. You're looking at data on the web. You're doing things that like just literally weren't possible 18 months ago before we had AI. And this took me a long time. I have a piece that I'm putting together now, which is like I did not have one light bulb moment with AI. It was like 100 little sparks. And I hope like when I say that, that's like a message of hope for people that is like, they're waiting for some aha moment. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's just like 100 tiny little things that happen and 100 tiny little use cases that kind of add up. And so over several months of consulting with companies, it was like, there's like this really interesting use case here that like I hadn't really thought about. Maybe they're doing something manually. Often it's they're doing something manually or they wished that they could do something manually, or maybe there's 30 reps on the team that are individually doing something manually. And now it's like, we can just do that at scale. We can train an AI to do exactly what they're doing manually that takes them 20 minutes per contact. And we can do that at scale across 5,000 contacts in their CRM. And that's incredibly valuable to a company. You could do it across tens of thousands of companies in their CRM, right? Like now every account has these 6 very specific data points that the company cares about. And these data points are not in a B2B database. So that has nothing to do with outbound. That has to do with like cutting books of business, about reporting, about ABM, like it has to do with your entire go-to-market strategy. And so that foundational data layer is one place that I'm finding AI to be a very good area where it doesn't have to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be 100% accurate. It's not going to have 100% coverage. It's not going to have 100% accuracy, but it's very good. It's very, very, very good. I think hallucinations are a thing that people talked about a lot like 12 months ago. That doesn't happen like it used to. These things are getting very good. So I would just think about like, and then it happens all the way through the life cycle. AEs, how do you equip them? Renewal, how are you doing renewal? Churn prevention, expansion opportunities. I think these are all amazing places to deploy resources, to build systems, and to use a GTM engineer or somebody that is doing these sorts of things who is like proficient with data, they're good with systems, and ideally they're incentivized on this thing. And I think, let me just add this one last bit. The incentive structure, I think, is very important to think about. If you're a CRO, I would think about, the cliche, the kind of classic Charlie Munger, which is show me the outcome, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. I think that's like really true here, where if you're going to have a person that is incentivized on generating pipeline, on converting pipeline faster, on shortening sales cycles, like they need to be in the right department. They need to have literally like an OKR and or bonus based on those things. And you should really think deeply about like, how do you incentivize that person to actually drive those outcomes and give them 25% or 50% of their OTE in upside? I think that's like the way, in my strong opinion, that's the way to incentivize people.
So one of the things, so this kind of gets into, a big question that I have, which is that incentive structure and where they fit in the organization can be a little tricky, because when I think of the GTM engineers that I know about, is they kind of a lot of times straddle a little bit of like what you would think of as a traditional RevOps job, what you might think of as traditional like demand gen, what you might think of as maybe even, tailing into like IT and systems a little bit, right? And then, of course, a dollop of sales. Given all that, where would you put a GTM engineering role in a, traditional GTM org? Like if you're CRO and you've got your, kind of straight up like normal org structure, where would you say like we should put this person?
Yeah. It's a good sign of something is like new and messy when people don't have a good answer. I think this is a good example of that. Like I definitely don't have a good answer for that. I haven't really heard a compelling answer to that question where everybody aligns. I think that shows that like this is super new and messy and therefore like a very big opportunity for companies to like dive into that messiness and just figure it out. I mean, I think the obvious places are either RevOps. RevOps is probably where it should live, in my opinion, if I had to guess. But like, again, I don't have a super strong opinion. I've seen it live in demand gen, and I've seen it live in RevOps and work in both of those places. I've seen it actually directly report to a co-founder, and I've seen it, at least in one case, report to the COO. I think it depends on, similar to like, where should the SDR team live? It's like, do you have a CRO or a CMO that has a bunch of experience with and wants to manage an SDR team? I think it's probably similar here, where it's like, do you have a strong CRO that has kind of a technical, not like coding technical, but like a systems thinker?
Mhm.
And if that's the case, they probably should roll up to the CRO. That might first roll up to a head of RevOps or something, but that's how I would think about it. If you just want to have them like doing demand gen and more like pipe gen type stuff, then maybe it makes sense to be in under like directly living under demand gen and not in the RevOps org. I really think RevOps has the best opportunity to like own the full buyer cycle. I want RevOps to be the department that owns the full buyer cycle from top of funnel. If it's PLG, like the PLG, PLS motion, DR, BDR, AE, account management, renewal, expansion. Somebody should have line of sight to that entire buyer journey and be thinking from a high level, how am I architecting people, systems, and process around that entire buyer journey? The reality is today, to do that, you need like 28 different tools and 4 different departments, which is a nightmare. But aspirationally, I think RevOps should own that full buyer journey, and a GTM engineer would live in that.
So I would tend to agree with that, if only because that mandate you just described is kind of the original idea behind RevOps anyway, right? And so, if you don't have it live in RevOps, it does sort of beg the question of like, why is RevOps, like, where is RevOps falling down in terms of what they're supposed to own theoretically, though I think we all know that RevOps sometimes is like a rebranded sales ops, and it kind of has a much more limited scope than it's theoretically supposed to. So, but that said, like I'm curious, if we've got this RevOps org, if I'm a CRO and I've got 5 or 6 people in a RevOps org, and I've invested in that, why isn't RevOps just doing this? What makes a GTM engineer fundamentally unique here as a role? Why do we need a new title when we've got a bunch of folks who are supposed to be responsible for systems and process and technology and all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they could. I think they could. I mean, there are a lot of great companies with really great RevOps orgs that are doing a lot of this stuff. They are building AI workflows. They are buying clay and deploying it thoughtfully. They are thinking through the entire buyer journey and architecting gates and outcomes and systems to match that kind of nuanced buyer journey. I think where it breaks down is RevOps has so much they already are doing, like cutting books, territory planning, cutting books of business, comp planning, dashboarding, managing systems. Like there's so much on a RevOps team's plate already that if you're also then saying, hey, you need to help drive efficiency in inbound conversions and pipe gen and conversion rate and sales cycle for AEs using unstructured data and like all these other things that are now possible with AI and automation that weren't possible 2 years ago. I just don't think they have the incentive structure to go out and learn all of this new stuff and do all of this new stuff on top of the 30 things they're already doing today. So I think it's like a matter of specialization. It's a matter of there's this current skill gap. I think they're perfectly positioned to learn those skills, but they aren't currently doing these things. And then again, I think the incentive one is I feel very strongly about that one. They're not incentivized to go increase pipeline or conversions by X% next quarter.
The thing that this seems to bear the most similarity to, in my mind, is growth teams at like PLG companies, right? Like that's a known existing kind of role. And you mentioned the thing that kind of sparked that. You mentioned like some of these companies have those teams report to like a founder or somebody who sort of has the moral authority to cut across these different components, founder, COO, something like that. Do you see parallels there, and what are those parallels, and how do you see this as distinct from those things and those kinds of work?
Yeah, I think growth is like very closely aligned with GTM Engineer. If you look at like a Rippling or a Ramp or some of these bigger companies, Stripe, like some of these bigger companies, fast growing growth stage companies with really, really smart growth teams, that's basically a GTM Engineer in my opinion, at least on kind of the top of funnel side of things. And some of them are doing some of the like full sales cycle, full life cycle stuff. So like expansion, renewal, those sorts of things. I think traditionally growth is more, especially for a PLG company, it's more like product side of things. So like doing growth loops and stuff like that. I think, and less so, again, it's like, I would say it's different for every company, but the example I gave earlier, for instance, where you're enriching every account and every contact in your CRM using AI workflows or agents and a bunch of data sources, waterfall, maybe orchestrated by something like Clay. That's not really what a growth person does. And so I think that's where it's like, that it just doesn't fit quite into an existing role. And I mean, I'm not building a SaaS company that benefits from like a new title like GTM Engineer. I just think this is a thing that wasn't possible. It didn't exist 2 years ago for a bunch of the reasons we've talked about. And so I think it's okay to say, okay, maybe there is some new job to be done here that we need to staff a dedicated person or a couple of people around this. Or say, hey, we're going to take a RevOps person and retrain them, upskill them, and say, hey, you no longer have to do these 9 things. Instead, you're going to do these other 9 things. I think that's okay too, but it's different. There's not one title at a company that is doing what great GTM engineers are doing today. And again, I just want to reiterate, it's not just getting a Clay license and doing a bunch of outbound. It's much more thoughtful than that.
And I think that's kind of in as much as, folks like senior sales leaders have thought about the role, known about the role, it kind of looks like that, right? It's like you see the occasional person who's built some kind of crazy workflow that they're sharing, or like, oh yeah, they're like, absolutely rabid about Clay, and those are like key tools, but it's so tools oriented. And so I think but kind of going into a little bit about what you were talking about there, I think the thing I'm kind of curious about is like, what is that skill set? Like, what is it if you were to define the role overall, and really what I'm getting to here is, if I'm a CRO and I get excited about this role, I've got to go do a couple of things. I've got to go figure out how to scope this role. I've got to figure out who it's going to report to. I've got to figure out how to incent them and comp them. And then I have to go justify all of that to, the powers that be in terms of like budgeting, headcount, and all of those kinds of things. Right. So, help me think about the role itself in terms of like the capabilities I should be looking for. Like what does that job listing look like?
Yeah, I can share some examples, by the way, if it's helpful, of a couple job descriptions that I've seen or I've even helped put together. Definitely, if I'm a CRO, so let's see. If I'm a CRO, I think I would think about somebody that is technical, or somebody kind of like a growth person or a RevOps person. Ideally, it's somebody that has a background in sales. I really would love to see somebody that was an SDR or an AE, because they're going to understand deeply and just kind of like intuitively ICP, key buyer personas, messaging, calls to action or offers. And those are really important to be able to just determine what data points do I want to build an AI workflow around to go push into our CRM for 40,000 accounts, right? So like, I think that a RevOps person would technically be good at doing that exercise, but knowing like what data points are actually really helpful to convert somebody, what data points are really helpful in terms of expansion or retention, etc. I think those are the things that like foundational baseline knowledge is incredibly helpful. And then I do think like being able to use tools is a big part of it. I wrote a post called Gear Acquisition Syndrome, GAS. I think you also like do need to avoid this idea of like a tool is going to solve the problem, where like, you know, Clay is the answer or whatever. That's not true. Or even AI is the answer. That's not the case. But obviously like tools do give us leverage, and they do enable us to automate things that we want, that we couldn't otherwise automate. And so I do think this person, you know, she needs to be able to use modern tools and is up to date with kind of like the latest and greatest there. And AI, I think it's no longer a nice to have, but a need to have, to be kind of AI fluent, or what I would call like an AI native worker, where it's like your daily, you know, if I was screening for somebody, it's like I'd ask them like, what are you doing in your personal life with AI? What's your favorite model? What's your favorite AI model right now, and why? Like, in a couple of minutes, you get a pretty good sense of like, is this person just like spending 5 minutes on ChatGPT a week, or are they like deeply embedding AI workflows in their day-to-day workflow? So those are the things I would think about. Then I do think OKRs, like what is the actual thing you're trying to drive? What is the goal? Are you trying to generate more top of funnel? That person probably looks, you know, that could be like a 110K person in the US. Are you trying to do things throughout the entire life cycle? That's probably going to be $200,000, $300,000 a year person, if they're going to be really strategic or more, and be able to do kind of the strategy and the execution of these things. And then the last thing I mentioned is, I think we haven't talked about this too much, but it's super important, is like the stage of the company. And so if you're building a job rec, I think it's, first of all, if you're like under $1 million of revenue, you don't need a GTM engineer. You very likely don't, unless you have lots and lots of like open source or PLG users. You probably don't need a dedicated person doing all this stuff.
I'm curious,
Yeah.
why do you say that? Like, why do you draw that line? What's it about that you think makes that the case?
There's just not enough data to make usable. And there's not like, the way I think about it anyway is, a GTM engineer is going to help you scale once you've gotten a playbook that's running, once you know what works internally. If you can interview a sales rep and they say, every time a good lead to me, I go to the website, I scroll down to the bottom, I see, do they have like SOC 2 verification logo? And then I go and see, do they have this specific person at the company, this title? And then I go see, do they have any of these 10 tools? Okay, that's a really good looking account. If it's yes to all of those, it's like, okay, cool. Let's put that on a Google Doc. And now we can go build an AI agent to go do those exact things. And I can just say, do that for these 40,000 domains. And I can just pipe down into the CRM. If you don't yet know what those 3 things are, or those 8 things are, there's nothing to scale. There's nothing for a GTM engineer to use. If there's not a ton of calls being done and using kind of that unstructured data to build into kind of AI workflows, doesn't make sense. So again, I think about like, the founder has to find product market fit and get from 0 to 1. A GTM engineer, I don't think they're really going to help you find product market fit. Founder needs to get from 0 to 1. Once you get to 1, then a GTM engineer can get you from 1 to 10, or from 10 to 50, or you know, or if you're at 200 million in revenue and you're kind of stalling, where you need to get 20% or 30% growth this year, and you don't have budget to hire a bunch of people, how do you build these little micro efficiencies throughout the buyer cycle? That's where it's like, okay, a GTM engineer makes a lot of sense.
I know I sort of interrupted the like kind of stage progression I think that you were about to talk about, but I am curious because the way you just framed it is as taking what works and scaling it, right? But we kind of also drew the analogy to growth teams in the past. And one of the things that's one role of growth teams, but another big role of growth teams is experimentation and figuring out what works and what knobs to turn. So where do you feel like experimentation fits into this role?
Yeah, I think you have to do both. What I've seen is, um, by the way, when I'm saying like, hey, a sales rep is going to do these manual things, or I'm listening for a sales manager is like, I'm listening for these specific questions and answers to determine if this is actually going to be in my forecast this quarter as a deal or not, or when to reach back out to a closed loss deal, or, uh, you know, like certain technologies in use or not in use, and I'm scraping job descriptions to find those technologies. All of those are like little things that are working, but then until you really operationalize them and scale them, we don't yet know that that actually works at scale. And so I'm more like mining for ideas, and then I'm scaling those as experiments. I think about, and then in parallel, very similar to a kind of a traditional growth person, is like running full on experiments and saying, I'm going to run one experiment every week. And so by the end of this quarter, I'm going to have 12 experiments. And I know that probably 10 of them will fail. 10 out of 12 will fail. One of them will be okay. And then one of them is very good. And that one will kind of pay back the fund. It's like portfolio construction in a venture capital fund. It's like they've got 20 bets they make in a year. They know 18 are going to fail. One breaks even, but then one hits, and it hits big, and it pays back the fund. And so I think about building out experiments in a very similar way. Again, speaking to a CRO, it's like that CRO has to know that you might go 2 months without seeing a win in terms of an experiment, in terms of like getting a big win. And so that's where I think you have to have, okay, we know these things work. Let's make sure that we're scaling those things that we already know work. And then in parallel, you're building this portfolio of bets, and in the hopes that one or two really pay back, every kind of quarter or something.
I mean, this is where I think the growth team analogy, you said it, you mentioned like, product led teams, you're often like experimenting in the product and stuff. And the implication of that is you have this big surface area. You can get a reasonable sample like in a relatively short period of time. So the more you transition into a sales led approach and the lower the scale of the business, the less you have the ability to build a sample that gives you any meaningful experimental values. It's kind of an interesting thing where it's like, yeah, I would love to be experimenting, but I would have to experiment for an entire year before I actually like got enough to tell me that there's anything, any signal there. But I want to go back to what you were talking about, because you were going down a path I really do want to touch on, which is what are the prerequisites? Like what are the things you need in your org to hire a GTM engineer? I know you have a post on that.
Mhm.
So you mentioned something that you've kind of gotten a product market fit, like you've gotten to that point. Now you've got some things where you can like start to automate them, but like, what's the rest of that maturity curve, I guess? Any other detail on that?
Yeah. So like you said, I wrote a post of when you should hire a GTM engineer. This is like, yeah, again, my current take, I don't know. There's a lot of nuance to this stuff. But I basically like at the most general stages, it would be there's no product market fit like we talked about, so it's just founder sales. You probably don't need a GTM engineer. I would say the second stage is like, okay, you've got maybe semblance of product market fit, or maybe it's product market fit. Let's call it $1 million in revenue or something like that, or maybe not quite $1 million in revenue, but it's like, okay, we've got $500,000 in revenue. There's probably some sort of known playbook that the founder or maybe one or two sales reps are doing, that it's like, okay, I think we can start to scale this. I would basically just experiment with this. You can hire somebody to do some testing for a few months. I don't think you necessarily like. I think this needs to be a core competency of the CRO. I think Jason Lemkin and Kyle Norton talked about this at SaaStr a couple of weeks ago, and I totally agree. I think it's really hard to like just say, hey, I'm going to hire some like shop to do this stuff for me outsourced, and I'm going to pay them, 5 or 10K a month for the next 18 months. I think your ops team, your CRO, eventually a GTM, dedicated GTM engineer or whatever, like it doesn't necessarily need to have that exact title. Somebody needs to be really focused on these things. But I think for a few months, you can kind of test things. You can have like an external consultant doing some of this stuff. And then once you figure out, okay, this stuff really works, this is giving us a lot of leverage, then let's go actually hire somebody full time. That's what I'm seeing firsthand is like, and by the way, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it's like, I think there's, I've seen companies that try something. They have very good people working on this stuff. And after 3 months, they're like, hey, actually, there's not a ton of leverage in the business. But once you find leverage, it's pretty obvious. It's like, yeah, I can see that this is going to be like, I want somebody full time, 100% dedicated to this. And then you would hire that person. And the way you would see that is the experiments. They find an experiment or two that's working. They build something that's like incredibly valuable to multiple people across the org. Ideally, it's like even more quantifiable, which is like conversion increased from 7% to 9% across the AE team, because we were able to pull out all this rich data from unstructured data, pipe it into not only their forecast, but recap emails, decks, like throughout the life cycle of or the sales cycle. So I think you can kind of quantify it, and you can get there pretty quick. I think 3 to 6 months, like really 3 months, I think you can get 4 months maybe. You can get a really good sense of, is this going to be a good fit? By the way, you can also just have like a RevOps person on your team spending 20% of their time. I think if you have somebody that's like really kind of AI curious, starting to tinker with stuff, wants to play with the new tools, is spending, nights and weekends listening to the latest, whatever OpenAI model drop, like that's the person that you want to double down with and like give them the resources to run. So that's basically how I would think about it. And, maybe there's an argument again for like doing it a little bit earlier if you're a PLG company, but I think if you're a 4-person startup, like I would not recommend you hire a GTM engineer before you hire like an AE.
Right. Well, so, and I think you've kind of outlined, a set of things so far, this idea of like maybe them being a little bit more like, it's really good if they have a sales background and bring the technology background as opposed to maybe being like technology with a, a little bit of sales. And so that leads to, you touched on it for a second. It's like, if I'm thinking about trying to staff this, right, this type of role, I'm also thinking about where am I sourcing this from? So you talked about there's so many agencies out there that, say that they'll do this for you. I agree that at a certain point, it needs to be a core competency. You can probably use the agencies to dabble. And then that gives you then the next choice of like, okay, how do I get someone focused on this? And I think there's, hiring externally, but it is a really, really new role, right? And so, then for a role like this, there's, RevOps has the tried and true path of basically you hire like now that RevOps has been around for 10 years or so, you can hire people who are actually RevOps people who've done this, right? But like the kind of old way was like the SDR who's really good with spreadsheets, right? But maybe not as good of an SDR, and you like bring them in and then they start to kind of mature into somebody who's more analytical and more operationally focused. So, if I'm thinking about, okay, I want to bring somebody in who's curious about this stuff, and I've got maybe, I can like look at my RevOps team, I can look at maybe my SDR team. Where would you be looking internally? Like, what's the profile of an internal hire that you might want to say, like, hey, I want to bring you into this role?
Yeah, I think RevOps can be good. Sorry to keep pointing back to my post, but I have a post called How to Become a GTM Engineer that has a bunch of 8 resources. So there's like kind of in that post, it's kind of crawl, walk, run, and it's very specific. Many of them are completely free resources. I think you have to just upskill somebody internally, right? So it's like, yeah, I'm hiring a GTM engineer with 10 years of experience is like would be the meme. It's like there's no, it wasn't around 10 years ago, but there's definitely somebody that has been in growth or been in ops for 10 years. And like, that's the person that is going to be the GTM engineer. That's how I think about it. There's not many people though that are like currently GTM engineers at Series B companies and are now looking for a new job. I would at least in 2025 and probably in 2026 as well, like I would think about upskilling is the wrong word. Reskilling, is that a word? Like reskilling somebody to be able to do these things. And that's probably somebody that's on your RevOps team, or maybe like sort of a technical SDR or AE if they haven't already made the jump to ops, but they're going to be pretty junior and not super strategic, frankly, or like a growth person, kind of like a growth marketer or yeah, growth person could become a GTM engineer. And they're probably doing 80-90% of the stuff today anyway. It's just like a reframing, learn a little bit more, and then reframing of kind of what they're focused on.
And I'll make sure to link to some of these posts you're mentioning, because I think that one of the challenges, I'm thinking as a CRO is like, okay, I'm supposed to upskill or reskill this person, but I don't have anybody in my org who has any of these skills, right? So how are they? And that's why I'm getting in the first place. So
Yeah.
how do we actually do that? And I'm guessing that how to become a GTM engineer probably has some resources there
Yeah.
to point to. Well, let me just to wrap up here, I would love to kind of turn to the practical, right? I'm a CRO. I'm considering this role. I'm starting to think there might be some places I could get leverage, right? Like maybe I've got 2,000 account, books of business, and my reps are only covering 20% of them, and I know that they're not picking the right 20%. So maybe there's leverage there, like prioritizing accounts, that sort of thing. What's the one thing that I should take away from this? The one thing I should go do to try to decide if this is the right step for me in my org to get this role.
I'll share three things that popped into my head. Number one, I would write down like what you just said. You probably know, you have some sort of gut feeling on like where there are weaknesses in your go-to-market org or opportunities in your go-to-market org that you think maybe this could be a good place. So write those down. Maybe there's 5 of them. Maybe there's 25 of them. Number two, I would go talk to an AI with that same thing. I would just pull up your ChatGPT and just talk to it, just explain what you're trying to do and ask it, give it context if you're PLG or not, if you're tops down, how many accounts do you have? Like just give it as much context as you can, upload docs, whatever. And then just say like, where are the places that you think AI and automation can give me leverage? And I think if you do those two things, I think the third one is just like start testing little things. I would not try to like boil the ocean here. It's like just test 1 or 2 areas and ship something in production, and you're going to learn a lot more than like reading my articles if you actually just ship something in production. And you're going to, the minute you hit ship, you're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn exactly what you should have actually built, because it's probably not going to be the thing that you ship. And similar to product, building products is you just have to ship things to actually learn. And so that would be maybe my message as we conclude here is like, and again, speaking just as much to myself, like I want to actually ship things and not just like live in this theoretical. And so it's like taking one specific workflow and having the CRO themselves can do this stuff. Like it's all no code tools. You don't have to find a RevOps person and hire them. You should just do it on nights and weekends. If you're the CRO, ship something and you're going to learn a lot from that.
I love that. And by the way, I'm hearing more and more from senior leaders who are just rolling up their sleeves and going and doing these things, right? I think it's easy to get in kind of the strategy mode, like who should I delegate this to in my organization, right? Who do I name as our AI like committee leader or whatever? But like the reality is, go roll up your sleeves and go use some of this stuff. Go vibe code something. Go build a workflow. Like the technical bar is very, very different than it used to be, and the things that you'll understand are you'll learn so much faster just actually rolling up your sleeves and doing that. It's not a long-term solution, but I think right now everything's changing so quickly that you can't just say like, hey, somebody go figure this out. You got to take some responsibility for that. So I love that as a good place to end. So thank you, Brendan. I really appreciate the perspective on all of this and everything that you've learned, and I really appreciate everything that you're sharing at the Signal. And we'll make sure there's several links to it so folks know how to get some of these great resources. So I really appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me, Hayes. Yeah, excited for what you're doing as well, and excited to continue to explore this wild new world with you. All right, thank you.